Herzlich willkommen zu einer neuen Folge im DreamCatcher-Podcast. Ich bin Stefanie, Autorin und die Herausgeberin. Herzlich willkommen zu einer ganz besonderen Folge. Wie du vielleicht schon mitbekommen hast, hat der Podcast einige Monate pausiert, denn ich war intensiv mit der Fertigstellung meines Buchs Make World Wonder für die Welt, die wir uns wünschen, beschäftigt. Nun ist mein Buch vor wenigen Tagen am 1. Oktober im Ökom Verlag erschienen und ich mag diesen Podcast wieder aufleben lassen. Langsam, ganz langsam. Denn ich habe in diesem Monat Oktober noch einiges damit zu tun, die Online-Materialien für das Buch Make World Wonder komplett zur Verfügung zu stellen. Und außerdem bereite ich noch ein Buch-Release-Event für Ende Oktober vor, mit dem ich das Erscheinen meines Buchs würdigen möchte. Doch zurück zu dieser ganz besonderen Folge. Heute habe ich nämlich Rob Hopkins zu Gast. Rob ist der Mitbegründer der internationalen Transition Town Bewegung, die in den vergangenen 13 Jahren seit ihrer Gründung in 50 Ländern Verbreitung erfahren hat. Er lebt mit seiner Familie in Totnes, einer 10.000 EinwohnerInnen starken Kleinstadt in Großbritannien in der Grafschaft Devon im Südwesten Englands. Totnes gilt als Keimzelle der Transition Town Bewegung. Rob ist Autor des Buchs Einfach jetzt machen, wie wir unsere Zukunft selbst in die Hand nehmen, das die Idee der Transition Towns beschreibt. Außerdem ist er einer der Protagonisten der Dokumentation Tomorrow, die Welt ist voller Lösungen, von der du vielleicht schon gehört oder sie sogar gesehen hast. Falls du ihn noch nicht gesehen hast, schau sie dir unbedingt an. Zur Transition Town Bewegung. Die Idee von Transition Town ist, dass Menschen die vielfältigen Krisen unserer Zeit nicht tatenlos und ohnmächtig stehen lassen, sondern selbst nach Lösungen zu suchen beginnen. Achtsamer mit den Ressourcen wie auch achtsamer mit uns selbst umzugehen. Und zwar mit den Möglichkeiten, die sie bei sich selbst vor Ort haben. So hat die Transition Town Bewegung vielfältige Lösungen, die sich immer mehr zu etablieren beginnen, entweder selbst aus sich heraus entwickelt oder aber inspiriert, wie etwa die Idee der solidarischen Landwirtschaft oder auch die Idee der essbaren Stadt, das Aufleben von Gemeinschaftsgärten oder die Gründung neuer lokaler Sozialunternehmen. In unserem auf Englisch gehaltenen Gespräch schildert Rob viele Beispiele aus der Transition Town Bewegung aus der ganzen Welt, spricht über seine Tätigkeit als Social Entrepreneur einer lokalen Brauerei und die Idee der Reconomy, wie auch das Local Entrepreneurship Forum, das sehr dabei unterstützt, dass lokale Unternehmen in Totnes viel stärkere und bewusstere Unterstützung erfahren. Außerdem sprechen wir darüber, dass wir nicht nur in einer Zeit der Klimakrise leben, sondern auch in einer Zeit, in der es gilt, unsere Visionskraft zu stärken. In dieser Mission ist Rob mit seinem aktuellen Buch From What Is to What If unterwegs. Das Interview mit Rob habe ich bereits Ende Juni aufgezeichnet, in der wir in Deutschland noch keine großen Demos die das Ende der Pandemie proklamierten, erlebt haben. Rob betont vor allen Dingen, wie solidarisch wir in der Pandemie füreinander da sind. Ich finde, unser Gespräch ist nach wie vor hochaktuell, denn es liefert jede Menge Inspiration und Beispiele dafür, wie wir unsere Welt anders gestalten können. Ressourcenachtsamer, solidarischer, nachhaltiger und klimafreundlicher. Viele reale Beispiele, die Rob schildert, zeigen, dass das geht. Also, lass dich von Rob inspirieren. Viel Freude bei diesem Gespräch. Alles Liebe, Stefanie. We are going to talk about your book, From What Is to What If. And that is about the power of imagination. You make it very easy for me because your book consists of 9 questions. And I just could ask those 9 questions. But yeah. What I also really like is the introduction of your book, where you seem to tell us a story of the future, but it isn't really a story of the future. The things you tell there are already in the present. So that's I like that very, very much. But before we dive into this book, you're co-founder of Transition Town Movement. Could you describe what is Transition Town? What is the Transition Town Movement? And what moves you these days with the movement?
So what is the transition movement? The transition movement, my favorite description of it is that it is a movement of communities who are reimagining and rebuilding the world. It is a practice, I guess, that people use and adapt at the local scale. It's based on the idea that the crises we face in terms of climate change and the ecological crisis and many of the other challenges that are currently coming up to meet us, that yes, of course, there are many things that governments can do. And yes, of course, there are many things that we should be doing as individuals. But there is a piece in the middle which says, well, what could we do with the people on this street? What could we do with the people in this town? What could we do with the people in our district here in this city, with the resources that we have, the people that we have, the knowledge and insight we have about this place that someone coming in from government with a clipboard really wouldn't have? And what can we do now with a sense of possibility and courage and let's try? And not perfectionist, let's try. And if it doesn't work, then that's really not the end of the world. And so it started here in the small town where I live in Devon, in Totnes, and it has since spread to about 50 countries around the world. And it is endlessly delightful and surprising and fascinating. And the solutions that people come up with range from the very small, just maybe planting a few trees on their street, to the really big and ambitious, like a city reimagining its food system or its energy system, and everywhere in between those two things. And one of the things that I've learned over the years is that those small projects matter just as much as the big ones. And what is motivating me now, I think, I'm really fascinated to see how many of the different ideas and thinking that have been pioneered in the transition movement over the last 12 or 13 years are now some of the ideas that are on the table as we start to emerge out of COVID-19 and start thinking about how do we build back better, how do we build something, how do we use this as the opportunity not to bounce back but to bounce forward to something better. And many of the conversations that I've had with people in lots of different organizations and movements, they're very much looking through transition and going, this is really interesting. This is an experiment that you've been doing for 12 or 13 years. And it looks interesting. And wow, really that bit's great. How come that one never went any, so I'm enjoying seeing a kind of a new wave of people discovering transition and thinking, this could be something useful. We should do something with this.
They discover it these days.
Yeah, that I find quite a lot of young people who are getting involved in movements like Extinction Rebellion, are finding that kind of that just being against something is not enough to kind of sustain them energetically and emotionally. And that they find the idea of something which is also about building solutions, part of the Extinction Rebellion narrative, and many of them are looking at transition and going, "Ooh, this is interesting," which is interesting for me,
Yeah, you just mentioned Extinction Rebellion, and of course, Fridays for Future is a comparable movement. They are against climate change. They go for that or against that on the streets. And yes, they are quite popular. In the 20th of September last year, we had 4 million people on the streets worldwide. How can we support them? And how can we somehow use this power?
Well, I think that is kind of happening anyway. I feel like I feel like those movements have been hugely powerful in terms of getting climate change really back into the center of the debates again, and particularly in London, because my wife is very actively involved in Extinction Rebellion. So I went up to both of the big rebellions in London, and thought they were fascinating. And one of the things that was really interesting was that many of the people who were involved are already involved in transition. It's often the same people. I went to Trafalgar Square during the October Rebellion, and every third person I met was, "Hi, I'm from Transition Liverpool. Hi, I'm from Transition West Kirby. Hi, I'm from Transition Bricks." There were loads of transition people there. We just have different hats. We put our Extinction Rebellion hat on, we put on our transition hat, whichever feels most at the time. So I feel like as we emerge from COVID-19 and after the work of Extinction Rebellion and Fridays for Future, it opens up a huge space for transition as well, because we have the so one of the things that came out of Extinction Rebellion was lots of local governments in the UK declaring a climate emergency under pressure from Extinction Rebellion. So they would then declare a climate emergency, and then they would say, "So now what do we do?" And then actually in the places where there were really active transition groups, they'd say, "Oh, we've been thinking about this for 12 years, and we've already started this, and we've already started that." And in Totnes and a couple of other places, there have been some really great events put on by the local transition group and Extinction Rebellion jointly, in that kind of, okay, we've declared a climate emergency, what happens next kind of a space, So I think the place where those two things meet and overlaps is only just now really starting to be explored.
As a present of COP21, you collected 21 stories of transition. And
I love
the
that.
next question is, what are transition stories, some transition stories of the world that impressed you? Perhaps one story of the Western world, one story of the South.
Yeah, I mean, I guess for me, one of the most exciting stories at the moment is the story that's in From What Is to What If, which is the story about Liège and the Liège belt. Which, I went to Liège about 5 years ago, and the transition group had this idea for a project that was called the Liège Food Belt. And the question, it was based on a what if question. They said, what if in a generation's time, the majority of food eaten in Liège came from the land closest to Liège? And it's such a beautiful question, so simple and ambitious. And then I went back after 4 years, and in that time they'd started 21 cooperatives. They'd raised 5 million euros of investment from local people. They'd started a farm, 2 vineyards, a brewery, 4 shops. I met the mayor of the city who said, this is now the story of the city. We used to say we wanted to be a smart city. Now we want to be a transition city. It was, for me, as somebody who spent 13 years going around Europe with a really kind of powerful vision in my head of how the future could be. Liège, I was in that future walking around. And it was a living, breathing thing. It worked, and it was wonderful. And it wasn't like something out of a science fiction film. But it was so much better. And so for me, I loved that story because it is one of the most ambitious projects. And when I said to them, how did you do this? How did you raise that kind of money to do this? They said, because we had a great story. It was about the narrative. This whole project came down to story, the fact that we had a really good story. So Liège, I think, is certainly in Europe is one of the most ambitious ones. And one of the ones that I always love was is one of the stories that's in 21 Stories, actually, is the story from Brazil about in Sao Paulo, when they had the droughts, had terrible droughts, the worst droughts in the history of the city. And people started to set up rainwater harvesting systems so that they would have water, but they weren't doing it very well, and insects were getting into their water supply and people were getting sick. So people in a really wide range of neighborhoods, from favelas to kind of middle class neighborhoods, came together to create a workshop to teach people how to harvest their water in a way that people could do, whether they were in wealthier housing or poorer housing, recognizing that everybody needed to do it, and it needed to be done as a kind of an act of solidarity. So they ran lots and lots of these workshops, bringing people together, building resilience around water, building social connection across communities. I love that. And then there's a story from South Africa, which I think is in that book as well, from Greyton, which is a transition initiative in South Africa, who are doing some amazing stuff. You know, there's loads and loads of projects, and they're working with kids in schools, planting loads of trees, doing stuff about waste, all kinds of stuff. Brilliant. And one of my favorite things they do was they had a young guy who went to volunteer with them, an American guy who went to volunteer with them. And when he was in Greyton, he went out to visit the tip of like the town waste dump in Greyton, and which is in a beautiful place overlooking these amazing colourful mountains and just stunning. He said, I stood in this place and I thought, I spent all of my teenage years going to festivals where we would arrive at a beautiful pristine green field and then spend 4 days covering it in rubbish. What would it be like if we went to a field that was already covered in rubbish and spent 4 days clearing it up? And so started this thing called the Trash to Treasure Festival, where they would have a festival with music and things at the tip, and then they would have clearing up the tip as part of the event. It's just beautiful. Mm-hmm. And part of it has involved this idea of making eco bricks, where you get a plastic drinks bottle and a stick, and you pack into the bottle all that kind of plastic, like crisp packets and food packaging that you can't really do anything with. And you pack it in so hard you can't get any more in, and then you put the cap back on, and that's a building brick. And they do more and more of those every year, and they're now building like an educational building using the waste. Mm-hmm. I just love that. That's such a beautiful kind of transition response to a problem, you
know. Yeah, super. Yes, and Transition Town Totnes is also vivid. There are also lots of projects flourishing. You not only collect stories, but you are a social entrepreneur. You're co-founder of a brewery. Could you tell us some transition stories of Totnes?
Yeah, I mean, I think at the moment, it's kind of hard to know because everything has been so kind of confused, I guess, by the virus. But I think before that happened, I think Transition Town Totnes, has been going for 13 years and done many, many, many amazing projects. My sense is that it's getting a little bit tired. Mm-hmm. That a lot of the energy that was very active in transition has gone to Extinction Rebellion. People have kind of got involved with Extinction Rebellion. But there are still some great transition projects happening. There's a project called Transition Homes, which is going to build 29 houses on the edge of the town using local materials, and they will be starting work, I think, later this year, early next year. The brewery that you mentioned, which is called New Lion Brewery, which is very highly recommend to people, is a brewery that we started as a kind of to be a transition social enterprise, I suppose. The idea of what would a community brewery look like if it was playing a really active role in transition. So we started in 2013. Last year we converted to become to a different model, to become 100% community-owned business. Mm-hmm. So now one of the very first community-owned breweries in the country. We have 270 owners. We raised £180,000 in a big crowdfunder, which will allow us to move the brewery into a new building alongside a bakery and mill, which has always been our dream. So hopefully by the end of this year, we will have achieved that. That's the idea. That's the dream of what we're trying to do. So that's been, it's one of my favorite projects. I really love being part of that. There's something about using local ingredients and building a community around a brewery that feels really precious to me. And part of the reason we were able to do that and raise that kind of finance was that through the work of the Reconomy project here in Totnes and the Reconomy Centre and the local entrepreneur forum, which is one of my favorite things that happens every year, where people invest in different local businesses. You know, we have created a culture in this town where the idea that you invest money in new emerging enterprises is kind of understood now, and people get really excited about it. So I recently saw a map that were all like there was a ranking of towns in the UK where people have invested the most in community share offers. Went London, Bristol, Totnes.
Wow.
Which I was really excited about, you know, because that's just fabulous.
The way I understand this local entrepreneurship forum, are also like that very, very much, is that is somehow a real crowdfunding. It's not virtual crowdfunding, but you come together and you crowdfund.
Yeah, the crowd are there. You can meet
and
people.
it's not only crowdfunding, but it's also I give you my time, I give you my smile, I give you my what I can. So it's so community driven, and I like that very, very, very much. What could be done? Not what can we do, but what could be done to cultivate that in other towns and cities? So that is a model somehow that could be copied.
Well, the local entrepreneur forum is absolutely a model that anybody can copy. You know, it's a beautiful. You know, it's pretty simple to actually do it. The thing that happens in the Totnes one is that there is a lot of work that goes on before the local entrepreneur forum to make sure that the people who pitch to the local entrepreneur forum are really good. Are really good and have a really good offer and a really clear request. You know, sometimes people will get up there and they'll be like, well, I wonder if anyone can help. You know, actually the ones who are really good who say, I need 100 people, you know, I need 200 people to invest £500, and in exchange for your £500, I will give you this, this, and this, and your role will be this. You know, they have a really clear package, like we had with the brewery share offer. So you know, Totnes, the Reconomy Centre does that work. It works with and mentors people and gets them ready to make the best pitch that they can possibly make, and that's a really precious thing, actually, I think.
Let's dive into your book. Concerning your book, one question that really moves me, and I think also moves other people, is how can we bring people to ask themselves more what if questions, and how can we make people dream and imagine more? How can we do?
Well, that is kind of the question that underpins the whole book, really. I mean, I guess the first half of it says, do we have a problem? You know, do we live in a time of imaginative poverty? Do we live in a time where we have a crisis of the imagination? And I fear that we do, and I really worry about it. It feels like when I started writing it felt to me like something that's just out of our vision, which we don't really give much priority to, which is just sort of fading away. And will continue to fade away until we go, whoa, hang on. That's really precious, until we name it and we say, no, this really matters. This decline will kind of continue. And to be the generation who dismantled or discarded their imagination feels like a profoundly heartbreaking legacy to me. So the first book says, do we have a crisis with the imagination? And concludes that yes, we do. And so the rest of it is, so what do we do about it? And one of the things that I talk about is that we need to master the art of asking really great what if questions. But the thing that comes before that only really kind of occurred to me about halfway through doing the research was the degree to which imagination is a function of privilege. And where we are creating this kind of perfect storm of factors that deplete and undermine people's ability to lead imaginative lives. If your basic needs on Maslow's hierarchy of needs aren't met, if you don't know where you're going to be sleeping in 3 weeks, if you haven't eaten properly, if you don't know where you're going to be working, if you are in trauma or lonely and isolated or really stressed, then we know from the research that causes the imagination to shrink, causes the part of the brain where the imagination fires from. It floods us with cortisol. And when we are flooded with cortisol, we can't be living an imaginative life. It's so much harder. So there is a profoundly political aspect to this, in that we are living in an economy, and you mentioned the article that I just wrote, published, where we could look at the kind of capitalist economy that we live in now as being a kind of a disimagination machine, and it erodes the imagination of the people at the bottom, and I think it erodes the imagination of the people at the top, and it doesn't really serve anybody's imagination, which is why I talk about why we need to look at how do we ensure that people have the right to live an imaginative life. We have an education system which has pretty much destroyed the idea of imagination within education. So we have an education system which kind of denies and devalues our imagination. We then go to university, where we often are borrowing a lot of money in order to be at university. And so we just want to get our piece of paper, and I think that and there's very little room within university degrees for a very imaginative life. Then we go into work context. Well, where's the space for imagination in that? That's just often about ticking the boxes and getting the results, and working really hard in our own personal lives, in our private lives. The time when we're at home, when we should be being imaginative, we tend to just fill with Facebook and social media and our smartphones, which are these profoundly addictive devices, and we spend less and less time outdoors. Every time we turn on the television, a lot of it is about and read the news. It's sort of adding to that sense of anxiety and that kind of cortisol. So I feel like we've created this perfect storm. So I think the ways that we get out of it, firstly, is by naming it and by recognizing that this is a problem. Mm-hmm. And we need to be creating what-if spaces in our movements, in our organizations, wherever we are. We know that the imagination needs space. No one ever came up with a great idea with a deadline of 11 o'clock that night, and they're tired and stressed. No one ever comes up with a great idea sitting in an office in front of a whiteboard with someone going, ideas, come on people, ideas. Albert Einstein always said his best ideas came when he was riding his bike in a forest. How many people give themselves the space to go and ride a bike in a forest? So the imagination needs space. I think the imagination needs places. It needs places we can go to where our imagination feels invited. Places we can go to that allow us to sort of look at things in a different way, that change our sense of what might be possible and how the future could be. Those can be pop-up spaces, they can be new places, they can be outdoor places. We also need practices that are things that we do in our groups and with other people, because imagination principally is something we do together. We can be imaginative on our own, but when we come together with other people and we're imaginative, it's so much greater than the sum of its parts. So we need practices that we do with other people, like, visualizing the future, or like the activity that we did at the transition conference in 12, about where we built the future out of cardboard boxes and string and sticky tape, and 300 adults played for 3 hours, lost in this world that they had built out of cardboard. It was just wonderful. So we need those practices that we do with other people. And then the last point in the book is that we also need pacts, what I call pacts, which is that we're also used to the idea of people inviting us to be imaginative, and then we take along our great ideas and we write them onto post-it notes, and then we go home and they throw them all in the bin and just do what they were going to do anyway. There is something profoundly respectful about meeting the imagination halfway. And that process of meeting the imagination halfway, the story in the book is about in Bologna, where the municipality created what they call a civic imagination office. And the civic imagination office invites people to go to events where they are imaginative and their ideas are invited. And then at the end of it, when they've come up with loads of ideas, the municipality say, that's a great idea. We should do that. Okay, we can offer this, this, and this. You can offer that and that. Good. Okay, let's make a pact. And then that project happens. And in the last 5 years in Bologna, they've made 500 pacts, from small projects, really big, really ambitious projects. So it feels to me like however we're working, we should have a system where whoever is next above us in the kind of decision-making hierarchy agrees that actually when it invites us to be imaginative, that it then meets our imagination halfway and makes pacts. I think if we have those four things: spaces, places, practices, including mastering the art of asking really good what-if questions, and then pacts, then we have a model that could lead to a really profound change across a very wide range of levels.
We live in a pandemic time, in a traumatic time somehow. How can we nourish that, this potential imagination, although we live in those times?
Yeah, I feel like if we believed Hollywood disaster movies, and if we believed neoliberal economics, which is underpinned by the fundamental, at our essence, we are all selfish and ruthless and horrible, then actually this pandemic would have turned out really, really differently. I think what we've seen over the last 3 months has been the most phenomenal flowering of love and community and solidarity and love. I think, the fact that the vast majority of people were prepared to shut themselves away in their homes for 3 months and not see anybody, and to just do that, is possibly one of the greatest acts of human solidarity in history, actually. Yeah. And what we saw as well in terms of this explosion of mutual support networks and people on their streets and in their apartments and in their towns and their neighborhoods, looking after each other, supporting each other, running errands for each other. I've never seen anything like it, and actually it's the opinion polls after that ask people, do you want it to go back to normal? 75% of people or something saying, no, we don't want to go back to how things were before this. This is a really important opportunity to rebuild things and to start again and do things differently. And, that's extraordinary. And we need to hold on to that as we emerge from that. I feel like a lot of the discussions that, you and I and people in the transition movement have been having for 10, 12, 13 years, and we have been kind of freaks, we're like completely like 10 years ahead of our time and considered strange. And, things like in Totnes, we did a big piece of work called Can Totnes Feed Itself? We mapped all the land around the town. What we called the food shed around the town, and the degree to which we could meet our own food and what structures we'd need. An amazing visionary piece of work. If we'd acted on that at the time, and we'd had the support to do that, and we'd created that system and that network, the discussions we had during COVID about food security would have been. So I feel like we are emerging from this now with many of the arguments we've been making now much, much easier to make to people. The idea that we need to look at a city or a town's food resilience and build new food systems and build, like in Liège, connections to the land around the city, that's no longer the domain of the progressive left. That's everybody's now. Everybody recognizes that actually food security is really important, and that COVID-19 was a disaster in terms of food security. And actually what we've seen that's happened is what we need to build off going forward. Whether it'll happen, it feels like our leaders are just dashing to get back to business as usual as rapidly as they can. But I think that a lot of I feel like, I mentioned about practices earlier on. One of my favorite things that I do, and I write about it in the book, is an exercise that I do when I start talks, where I invite people to close their eyes, and I say we're going to do the first act of collective time travel in the history of this place. And I tell them that I've bought my time machine all the way from Totnes, and when I turn it on, it's going to take us forward 10 years to 2030. And it's not utopia, it's not paradise. It is a 10-year. During that 10-year period, possibly have been done was done. And it was the most extraordinary time in history. There was a cascade of positive change that in 2020 felt unimaginable. But by 2030, the world is transformed and is extraordinary. And in your imagination, and we're going to travel into that future, and we're going to go for a walk around in it, using all of our senses. What does it smell like and sound like and feel like? And I've done that in a room with 15 people. I've done it online. I've done it in a room with 1,500 people, and it never fails to be extraordinary. And the first things that people say when I ask them afterwards to tell me what they saw were the bird song was louder, the air smelled so much cleaner, there were much less cars, there was a really strong sense of shared purpose and people caring for each other. And something else I can't remember. So that's what people say. And actually, for the last 3 months, particularly in the first month and a half of that time, that was what the world was like. It wasn't fantasy. It wasn't an imagining fantasy. You would walk out of your house, and that's what it was like. And you couldn't hear the cars, and the birds were louder, and the insects were louder, and I feel like I've seen so much of people writing about how extraordinary that was, and how precious that was, and how they saw birds they'd never seen before, and how my hope is that once people tasted that they won't want to go back again.
Mm-hmm. So you just mentioned what I want to do with you now. Let's make a trip to the future. Marty McFly and Doc Brown come to pick you up with their DeLorean DMC-12, and they are going to a trip to the future, to the year 2030. So in what kind of future will you be in 2030?
I mean, when I do that, and it's an exercise I try and do quite a lot, and it's how the book starts, is with me writing down that, because when I do this exercise, I find myself assembling different things from my memory. Imagination works, right? It's basically, our imagination is just us assembling things in our memory in new and unique ways. So when I do this exercise, I find myself walking down streets with no cars, like the ones I've seen in Barcelona, where they've blocked streets off and they're just full of people and birdsong and trees. And walking through urban food gardens like Princess Inn Garden and other really productive urban food projects I've seen, rooftop gardens like I've seen in Paris, down past big community energy installation projects like I've seen in parts of Germany and different places, stopping at community-owned businesses that have replaced supermarkets. Those spaces have been taken over and repurposed and turned into a kind of a showcase of the real diversity of the food culture of that place. This is a place like that in Rotterdam a couple of years ago, which was just amazing. All the different food, and there was a brewery there, and it was full of people and different flavors and different tastes and the real social cohesion, through bakeries that are community owned, more and more businesses that are community owned, through street markets like I've seen in parts of China, not the horrible markets in China, the nice ones, or that I've seen in parts of different cities, Amsterdam, really vibrant markets of food that is connected with the land around the city, living in buildings that are really energy efficient and built using local materials, like the Strawbale apartment block that I visited in Geneva a couple of years ago. And taking kids to schools which are completely reimagined, where schooling has become something which is about nurturing and cultivating the imagination, which are really embedded in the community, which are very hands-on. Kids learn to make stuff and grow stuff as well as to learn everything else. And there was a school that I visited in the Ruhr Valley in Germany a couple of years ago, where they did that. They'd made an outdoor wild area and they used it in all of the education time outdoors as they possibly could. So for me, that's it's I don't regard that kind of future that I walk through when I do that exercise as being in any way utopian, because for me, I know that it all exists and I know that it all works, and I've been there and seen it and touched it and smelled it. And there was an amazing project I visited last year in France, in a place called Montsartou, where the municipality changed how the schools fed themselves. They created a market garden on the edge of the town where they grow 70% of all the food that's eaten in all the schools. So 100% of all the food in all the schools is organic, and 70% of it's grown in this market garden. So when I'm there and I go and visit this market garden, it's full of bees, it's full of butterflies, they're growing the most amazing food. It's just wonderful. The kids love going there. It's changed the culture within the school. It's changed how many of the parents buy food, what kind of food they buy. It produced a really profound culture change in the school and in the community around the school. And I think, well, why would this not happen everywhere? This makes such total sense. It's a win. It's good for public health, good for mental health, good for physical health, good for the local economy, good for biodiversity, good for skills, good for education, good for young people growing up knowing where their food comes from. It's good for everything, good for water, runoff, everything. Yeah. Those are the kind of solutions that really excite me, and where I just think this is entirely possible. And again, it's that garden is a place that always comes to me when I do an exercise like that.
Mm. Yes, and not only that, there are plenty of solutions. There is, in fact, somehow I name it a master plan for solutions, and that is the Agenda 2030, the Sustainable Development Goals. What do you think of the Sustainable Development Goals? Do you see them as somehow as a master plan, or?
I think the Sustainable Development Goals are mostly fantastic. I think they have a bit of a kind of a fatal flaw at their heart, which I think is number 8, which is the one about.
Yeah.
But actually, the problem is that if you continue to pursue economic growth, you put all of the rest of them in peril. I think, particularly the ones around climate. So I would like to see a kind of a degrowth version of the Sustainable Development Goals. I think that would be more feasible. You know, it's like the difference between sustainable development, which is what the Sustainable Development Goals are about, which assumes we can have economic growth and we can have a decline in resources, and we'll have this very smooth kind of flow down towards a sustainable economy. Actually, as we've seen in the last few years, it's not like that. It's going to be a bumpy road with lots of shocks, pandemics and climate emergency crises and migration, you know, and all this kind of stuff. And actually that means that we need to be thinking about resilience. And for me, I wonder how the Sustainable Development Goals would be different if they were viewed through the lens of resilience. But there are lots of groups, transition groups and other groups, who actually find the Sustainable Development Goals really useful, and who have mastered the ability to talk in kind of Sustainable Development Goals language, which I think is maybe a more skillful way of you know, partnering with other organizations. But it's the bit that always troubles me is that they have at their hearts this belief in economic growth, which kind of jeopardizes the rest of what they're trying to do.
Okay, so to round up our interview, I would like to play cards with you, but I have to catch the cards.
Good.
So it's a special card play. It's called, it's in German. It's a card game for world wonder. And it consists of 17 cards. You can imagine what those cards could be. And I invite you to, I mixed them.
Okay.
And I invite you to tell me which card I should see for you. Perhaps the first from above, or
okay. So the fifth card from the top.
Okay. Okay. So that's it's SDG 4, and I call it lifelong enthusiastic learning. So,
Okay.
And my question for you is, what are you already doing for that, to contribute to that? That we learn lifelong enthusiastic.
I guess so. I am teaching. I'm teaching myself how to make lino prints. This is a new one I'm doing now. So I'm somebody who's always very curious, which I think really helps. So I'm always reading books and finding things out, and always trying new things and different things. So I'm very so for myself, I feel like I'm quite I'm always learning new things, and I don't just tend to get stuck doing what feels familiar. I also do quite a lot of teaching in other places, teaching about transition and teaching about permaculture and other things like that, and teaching about imagination stuff. And as somebody who has been who was a permaculture teacher for a long time, and who was really inspired by the most amazing book from Australia called The Manual of Teaching Permaculture Creatively, which completely transformed my whole approach to teaching, to say, if people laugh, they remember stuff. If people have a good time and they smile, then they remember stuff. If people get up and play and they teach other people the stuff they've learned, and then they remember more of it. And so I have developed a style of teaching which is driven by games and play and talking, and not just sitting listening to me talking for a whole day. So I'd like to think that all of the work that I do in transition and in this imagination work is fundamentally about creating longing, is about creating longing in people for a future different to the present. And that's really what kind of underpins a lot of my work. And fundamentally, that for me is what education should be about and what lifelong learning should be about. And if in a few years I manage to get some time and space, I'd like to go back to art college and learn to do printmaking properly. That would be the next stage of my own lifelong learning, I think.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much. Is there something you want to say to round up our talk?
I guess I would just say that for me, that I found this work on imagination gave me a really interesting lens to look at what we've been doing in the transition movement through. That you can look at the transition movement as being many different things. You can look at it as being an economic regeneration process. You can look at it as being a community development tool. You can look at it as being a kind of a set of practices and tools for kind of inner resilience building. People look at it in all kinds of different ways. Looking at it as being about creating the best conditions for the imagination and about the creation of what if spaces was a really fascinating kind of new way of looking at everything for me. And what I found as I was researching this book and having conversations with people about it, and I did more than 100 interviews when I was researching the book, was that the number of people that I would talk to who would say, where the idea that we are living in a time kind of got under their skin. And I found it was an idea that really got under my skin. I was thinking, is it just me? Am I mad here? Is this just some ridiculous, silly Rob idea that really has no legitimacy in the world? Or actually, is this something really important that people seem to have missed? And then I found actually there were people over the last 40, 50, 60 years who had been warning and who were saying, no, this is really important. And we're seeing if we let imagination decline, then that's really, really serious. And I would speak to neuroscientists who at the beginning I'd say, so do you think we have an imagination crisis? And they would say, no. And then after about half an hour, they'd say, earlier when you asked about the imagination, what did you mean by that? And I would explain what I meant, and they would say, oh, yeah, actually I've not looked at it like that before. That's really interesting. So I feel like what I hope is that there is something in the book which will really get under people's skin and will kind of get them questioning more about what we're seeing in the world, and is it okay? And looking at what might be happening. So yeah, I hope that it's something that people will find useful. And I would also just mention that I recently just started a new series of podcasts, which is called From What If to What Next, which kind of picks up from where the book is and invites listeners to send in what if questions. And then I take some of those what if questions and find the best two people to then explore with me, how do we make that a reality? How does it move from being what if to being what next? And if people want to subscribe, it's not very much. It's like a little small monthly amount, and you get different podcasts and interviews and things like that. So if people want to kind of continue this exploration and continue this journey with me, then that's a good place to start.
Okay, thank you very much, Rob.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And yeah, have a good afternoon in Totnes.
I will. And lovely talking to you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Vielen Dank, dass du dir diese Podcast-Folge angehört hast. Ich hoffe, sie hat dich inspiriert. Wenn du weiter zu diesem Thema forschen magst, schau im Beschreibungstext zum Podcast. Dort stelle ich dir Links zu Robs Büchern, zu Robs Podcast, wie auch zur Dokumentation Tomorrow, die Welt ist voller Lösungen zur Verfügung. Zum Thema Visionen und Aktionen für die Welt, die wir uns wünschen, lass dich auch gern von meinem Buch Make World Wonder inspirieren. Ich freue mich auch, wenn du mir Feedback gibst, wie dir diese Dreamcatcher-Folge gefallen hat und wünsche dir eine schöne Herbstzeit. Wir hören uns bald wieder über diesen Kanal. Alles Liebe, Stefanie.